Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Indie Grounds podcast. I have some exciting news for you guys before we go into the actual subject of today's episode. So I did take a week off this last week. I wasn't feeling the greatest, and it was kind of a busy week outside of this podcast. And then I'm also have some exciting news in that I have started a YouTube channel. Right now, we only have shorts. Brief synopsis of each episode I've put on the Spotify podcast, but I'm looking into maybe either migrating the podcast onto YouTube for exposure, or I'm going to have both podcasts, or I shouldn't say both podcasts, but both forms of this podcast spontaneously on YouTube and on Spotify. Whichever one I decided to go with, I'm just excited. It's super exciting. It's the same name. It's the Indie Grounds podcast on YouTube. But I'm very excited for it and excited for the future. But mostly, I'm just excited talking about indie music. I love, like I said before, music is such a big part of my life, and indie music is like a huge chunk of that. It's literally what I grew up listening to, and to this day, it's still what I gravitate towards. So I'm super excited for it. And I'm very excited to talk about the artist for this week. We are on the artist category. So without further ado, this week we are talking about one of my favorite people to talk about, Jack Antonoff. Now, at first, maybe the name might not sound familiar to you, but I almost guarantee by the time I'm done with today's episode, you're going to know exactly who this guy is. And if you don't, I'm even more excited for you because you should check out his stuff. So Jack Antonoff is, for the modern age of indie music, even for pop music, is such an important figure. So a brief rundown kind of before I do a deep dive into him. So Jack Antonoff is the creator, lead singer, and guitarist for the band Bleachers, again, which is a huge kind of band in today's modern age of pop indie music, but he got his start in the band Fun. If you remember, Fun in the 2010s was a huge band back then. He was their lead guitarist and writer. So that's where he started. But as we're going to move along in his career, you're going to see just how much influence he's had in the area of music nowadays. But again, let's kind of back up and let's kind of go through his history first. Then we're going to get into the bigger and bigger details. So Jack grew up in New Jersey, big Springsteen fan. If anybody listening does listen to Bleachers, you can almost hear that. And if anything, he had Bruce feature in one of his songs on his latest album as well. So huge Springsteen fan. But what's interesting in doing research with him, he said a huge influence in his style of music and in his writing process was his sister died when he was just an early teenager. So, that was some really sad news to hear about. And he said it just made a huge impact on his life, that he needed to kind of express himself in some way. And of course, he gravitated towards music. So he grew up, he graduated, everything was kind of normal at first. And then he made a band in 2002 with a friend of his called Steel Train. They're kind of well known in the, I shouldn't say well known, but they are known in the music arena, I guess you could say, with indie music, in that they had some smaller hits, but that really, if anything, kind of set him up perfectly for what was going to happen next, because pretty much as he was touring with Steel Train, starting to get some publicity, he ran into eventually his bandmates of Fun, Nate Roos and Andrew Dost, I think it is, or Dost, D-O-S-T, and they formed the band Fun. Now, that happened in 2008, 2009. They did make one album, Aim and Ignite, in 2009, but of course, everybody's going to know them more so from the second album that they made in 2012, Some Nights, where Fun just exploded. They were everywhere. They had radio hit after radio hit after radio hit, and they just boomed in the music industry. It's funny too, because a lot of people don't even really know that Fun had made 2 albums. In fact, I think one day I do kind of want to get into Fun's history, kind of like where they formed, how they broke up, so on and so forth. But of course, that happened. They were everywhere. They were nominated for tons of awards. It was just incredible, you know. And what was really cool is they gained even more fame because they opened up for Queen in September, I think, 2013 for the iHeart Radio Music Festival, and he actually got to play Brian May's guitar during rehearsal. That sounds so awesome. Now, while Fun is exploding, it's kind of interesting because I wonder if at the time if Jack knew what was going to happen, you know, if he anticipated that band being as big as they got, because he was starting to record Bleachers songs while he was on tour for Fun. Because Fun, that is, they started getting big, you know, around 2012, 2013, around that time. And Bleachers started early 2014. But he said he had been coming up with ideas for the band for like 5 to 10 years, even before that got big. But Bleachers also, I mean, to be honest, yeah, maybe they didn't get the huge success that Fun had, but Bleachers themselves has had their fair share of success as well. A lot of their songs too, they sound very, you know, like kind of like 80s pop and kind of like fun songs. But what's interesting, Jack has even said if you listen to the lyrics of many of his songs, they're very sad, they're very desperate, but they just kind of sound really catchy. So Bleachers first came out with their album again around 2013. And then in 2017 was their album Gone Now, their second album for Bleachers. And then in 2021, they released the album Take the Sadness Out of Saturday Night, which was their third album. And they have gotten huge success, toured, you know, had massive tour dates, so on and so forth. So that is kind of just Jack Antonoff's side of the story. Just kind of his own musical ventures. But like I said, he's had his own fair share of impact in the music industry, but it is more so in the writing and producing of other people's music. In fact, I mean, Fun kind of made up for a lot of this ground, but for other artists as well, Jack has won 8 Grammy Awards alone by himself. You know, writing for other people's music, or co-producing other people's music. He has won all of that. And again, Fun did win him some awards as well, but I would say the majority of them were the work that he has done. Now, the most notable person that he's worked with is Taylor Swift. And it started in 2013. He wrote albums for her on her album 1989. But then the biggest one that he did was when her album for Folklore came out and Lover came out in 2019 and 2020. He was a heavy influence on that album for her. You know, and they've done so many collaborations, so many projects together since then. It's just crazy, kind of the influence he's had on her career, kind of towards the later stages of her career, and totally changed it. He's also worked with Lorde. He's written a few songs and even helped co-produce some songs for Lana Del Rey and other smaller bands as well. He just loves to do it. He's worked with Sarah Bareilles. He's worked with Tegan and Sarah. So many bands he's worked with. And I would say the most recent, and maybe even one of the biggest ones, was the 1975's latest album in 2022, Being Funny in a Foreign Language. He helped co-produce that album as well. So he's been everywhere. You know, you could kind of just feel his hands in so many recent bands, and not even indie bands, like pop bands, work here in the late 2010s and early 2020s. You know, he's just been everywhere. There's not too much in his personal life. He's dated a few times, but he kind of keeps that private. And he also has a lot of struggles, which is actually ironically public, with depression, anxiety, OCD, and a lot of that, of course, he's put into his songs, whether it's on Bleachers, Fun, or with other bands as well. But it's pretty straightforward with him. There's not like a whole bunch of controversy that he's gotten into, any trouble that he's gotten into. If anything, it just seems like the majority of his focus has solely just been with music, and that's kind of where he's kept it. But again, just to wrap up, he's such a fun artist to listen to. If you haven't listened to Bleachers, man, I just highly recommend it. There's probably some bias here. I love Bleachers. I remember like when the first album came out. It's great stuff, and they're so fun to see live. So from his early days and his early roots, just kind of touring around with local bands, then his band Seal Train kind of gets big a little bit, but that kind of is the setup for getting into Fun. Fun kind of helps propel Bleachers, and then he gets into working with, other artists, other pop artists. It's been great for him. I wish him all the best of success. I hope he keeps going. And yeah, that's it for this week's episode of the Indie Grounds podcast. Jack Antonoff, huge contribution in the modern day era of indie music. Like I said, I really appreciate the support of this podcast. To all of you that are listening, as I always say every week, the only thing I ask for is if you could just recommend it to one other person, that would be great. And for the future of the channel so far, like I said, I'm opening up a YouTube channel for this as well, for the same podcast. There's not a lot on it right now. Like I said, there's just some shorts, but more of that to come soon. And thank you guys.